The remaining categories of particular evidence about individuals like Huang Yefu, you haven't heard much of him, evidence about particular phone calls to leaders of the PRC and CCP, which on their own would almost amount to confessions. Those additional areas of evidence do nothing to displace the conclusion reached, rather the reverse. And indeed, those conclusions fit with the overall conclusions reached by considering the overall background, which I referred to as the second element that we considered. And that background evidence was the subject of a conclusion by the tribunal that since 1999, the PRC and the Communist Party, the CPP, regarded practitioners of Falun Gong as unworthy of any of those universal rights that attach to human beings by reason of their humanity, simply to maintain their power and authority over the Chinese people. And coincidence with the developing persecution of practitioners of Falun Gong over time has been an enormous, unexplained provision of transplant hospitals in the absence of a voluntary donor system at that time. The tribunal does not have sufficient evidence to reach a conclusion of forced organ harvesting having happened with the Uyghurs. The vulnerability of the Uyghurs to the will of the PRC I've already touched on, and the vulnerability of them being used as a bank of organs is obvious. In reaching its conclusion, the tribunal has not, in the event, had to apply its knowledge of the multiple breaches of human rights law generally for which the PRC is known to be culpable, although it would be disingenuous at this stage of the tribunal's conclusions not to acknowledge that there is nothing inconsistent between the tribunal's conclusions and the PRC's human rights record. Continuity of forced organ harvesting. Has it ended? Evidence of the most recent availability of organs on demand is to be found in telephone calls of 2018 and in a Korean film of 2017. They are not in themselves sufficient to prove continuity of forced organ harvesting on the same scale, although they certainly do nothing to disprove it. More important is that the system has been in effect for years, despite international evidence-based concerns and criticisms and research asserting that the practice is proved. There is thus no particular reason for it to stop, and many people's livelihoods in the PRC depend on it. Further, it is clear from the evidence of torture by those who were imprisoned but not harvested that the authorities had objectives behind the overall treatment of members of Falun Gong other than the purely commercial purpose of harvesting and selling the organs. And further still, it would appear probable that access to a supply of organs has been one of the reasons that the PRC has been able to become so formidable in the skills required of transplant surgery, and thus to rise, subject to the shadow of these allegations, in the estimation of transplant surgeons around the world, several of whom support the PRC in public, as we have heard. There are maps, I'm not sure whether they're on display, but there are maps which identify all the hospitals spoken of by those tortured and medically tested, and those called by telephone in the telephone calls of significance. And so the tribunal is satisfied that the practice is continuing and that it's on a widespread basis. It should be made clear that it gives the tribunal no pleasure to reach this conclusion, to which it is driven by evidence and the application of reason and logic, together with its appraisal of witnesses who gave evidence. The conclusion shows that very many people have died indescribably hideous deaths for no reason, that more may suffer in similar ways, and that all of us live on a planet where extreme wickedness may be found in the power of those, for the time being, running a country with one of the oldest civilizations known to modern man, which ideally we should be able to respect, and from which we should be able to learn.